On the 16th of August last year in Parliament House, Canberra, we had a group of people led by Malcolm Fraser, academics, former diplomats, public servants, to call for a launch to have an inquiry into the war in Iraq. We wanted to do this because we felt the Prime Minister of the day had taken us to war against public opinion, and it wasn't a legal war anyway, and it just resulted in enormous problems in Iraq and the Middle East, destabilisation, and given Iran a leg up in the Shia kingdoms of that part.
Well, thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. I want to address several aspects of this question. Why we should have an inquiry into the Iraq war specifically, and then move on to some more general questions of what I think the solution is. From what we've known for quite some years, those who have studied the subject, the circumstances under which Australia became involved in the invasion of Iraq involved serious government malfeasance in several respects. First of all, we were lied to about when a decision was taken. In my view, as far as I can tell, we were committed not later than July 2002. The evidence of this is we participated throughout the second half of July in the planning process. What was our contribution to planning? What role Australian troops would take? You don't go into the planning of an American invasion on spec and say, look, we'll help you with the planning now and we'll tell you later whether we're going to be along for the ride. And Graham Dobell today on the ASPI website has a piece saying the reality is that all sides of Australian politics and everyone in Canberra knew the commitment had long since been made. The Australian military was deeply involved in US planning for the war that Australia was in. To his credit, Howard makes this clear in his memoirs, where he admits that all the public protestations about Australia having not made up its mind amounted to what that's Graham Dobell dubbed the big Iraq fib. There was never much question or even debate about Australia joining the US in the war. Australia did not keep its options open and didn't even explore the options. Second, Parliament was deceived as to the intelligence which was available. In his 18th of March 2003 motion, Prime Minister Howard said Iraq's continued possession and pursuit of weapons of mass destruction in defiance of its mandatory obligations, etc., represents a real and unacceptable threat to international peace and security. He also referred to Iraq's continuing support for international terrorism, conjuring up a completely spurious link to Al-Qaeda. Precisely because highly classified intelligence information cannot be revealed in parliamentary debate, when the Prime Minister uses phrases like "we know," we should be entitled to assume he has rock-solid intelligence as the basis for that knowledge. So we should not expect a subsequent inquiry to report, as Philip Flood's report did, that the evidence was thin, ambiguous and incomplete. The two inquiries into the performance of the intelligence agencies were a part of this pattern of malfeasance. Like its American counterpart, our government placed scant reliance on the intelligence assessments. And when the invasion turned out to be not such a great idea after all, they set up inquiries into the performance of the intelligence agencies. So I'll come back to that subject later. Fourth point, Parliament and public were deceived about the legality of the war and implicitly misled about the process that decides legality. Matters of law, including international law, are decided not by government legal advisers but by courts of competent jurisdiction. The role of advisers is to help people not to commit illegal acts. It is not to find spurious justifications to commit the illegal act. After the act is committed, then in our adversarial system, a lawyer will make the best case that can be made, but you're not supposed to do that before the event. You're supposed to give very sober advice about what the court of competent jurisdiction is most likely to decide. And it is in the charter of the ICJ that in international law, in the absence of decisions by the ICJ, the weight of international academic opinion is the best guide. The government dissembled about what the objective was. Was it about WMD? Was it about regime change, which was denied before the war but became the main post hoc justification? Much to his surprise, the Governor-General was not brought into the decision-making process, although he had been given to believe that he would be. We were even deceived as to when Australia commenced military operations, as pointed out by former diplomat Tony Kevin in a carefully researched paper first published in September 2004. it is clear that Australian Special Forces were engaged in lethal operations about 30 hours before the ultimatum expired. Not just surveillance operations that resulted in the death of Iraqi soldiers who were entitled to, they were not at that stage at all. We can reasonably ask what action our government took to satisfy itself that the proposed military action was proportionate and that it would not involve undue civilian casualties, both of which are requirements under the international customary law regarding preemptive military action, and what steps it took to satisfy itself that the threat to Australia's security from Iraq was sufficiently clear and present to fulfil the criteria required by international law. In that regard, it's clear the government was asking the wrong question. The question was not, has Saddam Hussein acquired or is he attempting to acquire weapons of mass destruction? The correct question was, is he a threat to his neighbours? And the answer to that was a resounding no. The Iraqi military were barely able to conduct operations within the NATO border. You might also ask what, if any, steps the government took to resolve conflicting views about the legality of the invasion and what steps it took to resolve intelligence conflicts. There was also governmental behaviour that could most charitably be described as unsophisticated. Why was government so ready to believe what the Americans said? Did it ever occur to them to ask whether what they were receiving was hard intelligence or an elaborate marketing scam to encourage us to participate? Was our government in on and a willing party to the scam, only too happy to sell this odious package of goods to the people that elected it? And as far as we can tell, it's very clear now the government has taken no advice from its civilian and military advisors, although it would have us believe it was wrestling with the decision of whether to go or not to go right up to the eve of the invasion. It took no advice from its civilian and military advisors. So there's clearly very much to be inquired into. I put it to you, the aim of this inquiry should be far more than just simply satisfying historical curiosity or exposing that malfeasance. But to consider how consistent with the defence of our national security we can prevent this unsatisfactory situation from arising again. And an inquiry, in putting forward our suggestion there should be an inquiry, we've met a resounding no from both political parties. Who cares? It's all 10 years ago. What happened 10 years ago, not important. Says the party that was very concerned with Julie Gillard 20 years ago, at that very time. But this suggestion we should have an inquiry really is very unexceptionable. It would be entirely consistent with current Australian government practice in every other field of human endeavour. Like any world-class defence force, the Australian Defence Force is assiduous in reviewing the conduct of every campaign in which it is involved, to identify and document the lessons learned, and to incorporate them into the development of future doctrine. It seems to me the Australian government owes it to those it puts in harm's way an equivalent discipline of evaluating the quality of the processes by which it decides to put them in harm's way. In the civilian domain, we are accustomed to holding inquiries after natural disasters and man-made accidents. We rigorously debate and scrutinise government administration and expenditure, how prepared we were to meet what eventuated, how well our command and control systems work, and we carefully investigate the causes of deaths and injuries. All of this is designed to learn from the experience and avoid future mistakes and losses. The Iraq War, indeed any war, should be treated no differently. And thirdly, program evaluation has been an established discipline in Australian public service for decades. It seems passing strange that the highest and most consequential program of all, the decision to conduct military operations in another country, is so far immune to these long-established and quite unexceptionable processes. Now, I've described a whole grab bag of things that I think the government did wrong. What would we do by way of an inquiry to ensure it doesn't happen again? I would like to suggest that this pattern of misbehaviour is bound by a common thread. The fact that the power to deploy the Australian Defence Force into international armed conflict rests in effect with the Prime Minister, who has no institutional obligation to consult Parliament or indeed anyone else. All that is required, it seems, is for the Minister of Defence to issue an instruction to the Chief of the Defence Force. This would come as a surprise to Sir Arthur Tang, who drove through reforms of the Defence Act in 1975, because what the Prime Minister seemed to rely on is the statement in the Defence Act that the Minister for Defence is responsible for the administration of the Defence Force. So all he has to do is write a little note to the CDF and say, I want you to invade this country, and that's all you need. Now, that right of the executive to make this decision, the right of the executive rather than the Parliament to decide to send troops to war is in the Australian constitutional context a legacy of the royal prerogative, which in turn has its roots in the pre-democratic notion that the power to make war is an attribute of the sovereign rather than the people. In the world of the 21st century, in any society founded on the belief that power flows from the people to the state rather than from the state to the people, it is both an anachronism and an anomaly. As the decision to commit Australian troops to the invasion of Iraq shows, the current situation in which the Prime Minister, with or without the advice and consent of his colleagues and their departmental advisors, can commit Australian forces to war or war-like operations in circumstances short of a direct attack on Australia's homeland can have a range of undesirable consequences, including misleading, overstated or over-certain claims to the Parliament and people patently absurd claims of self-defence against a real and imminent threat to Australia, a lack of clarity as to what the mission is, etc. The pattern of Australian decision-making on several of the most important deployments since World War II, notably Vietnam, Afghanistan and Iraq, had one or more of these undesirable features and has consequently raised substantial domestic dissent. In each of these situations, the government of the day had in mind some party political advantage through the exploitation of a claimed special relationship with the US, as well as of patriotism. One might have expected this to have disappeared at the end of the Cold War, but this reasonable expectation was dashed by the decision to join the war in Iraq. The Iraq War raised grave questions of legality, as I've suggested, and the then government's defence was unconvincing. This is a highly undesirable situation for a country like Australia, whose security is bound up with observing international legal norms and encouraging their wider acceptance, including in the Asian region. Asian countries have been trenchant critics of the failure to respect the international norms relating to the use of force and the misuse of the United Nations by the coalition of the willing. The invasion of Iraq is very difficult to justify by reference to the traditional criteria enshrined in the customary international law on preemptive or anticipatory self-defence. The standard precedent for which is the Caroline case, which arose from an 1837 attack by Canadian loyalists inside the United States territory on a vessel that was being used to aid the activities of Canadian Republican rebels. The Caroline affair has been used to establish the principle of anticipatory self-defence in international law. The principle is quite restrictive. It holds that preemptive action may be justified only in cases where the necessity of that self-defence is instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. It is well established that to be a valid use of force in terms of self-defence under international customary law, there's a need that it be immediate, proportionate, and necessary. It's clear that the rights that flow from that case can be invoked only within very narrow confines. Defendants of Nuremberg sought to invoke them as a defence in relation to the invasion of Denmark and Norway, but the International Military Tribunal was not impressed. Just like I say, I sort of return to the subject of the use of intelligence. The decision by the coalition of the willing to commit an invasion of Iraq, ostensibly in pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, is often characterised as a failure of intelligence. I submit this claim is in itself another example of misleading the Australian public, as it was indicated by the following first-hand account of what was going on in the United States, upon which Australia relied so heavily for its intelligence assessments. Writing in the prestigious journal Foreign Affairs, Paul R. Pillar, who served as the CIA's National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia from 2000 to 2005, says, in the wake of the Iraq War, it has become clear that official intelligence analysis was not relied on in making even the most significant national security decision. The intelligence was misused publicly to justify decisions already made. The damaging ill will developed between policymakers and intelligence officers, and that the intelligence community's own work was politicised. Philip went on to say, if the entire body of official intelligence analysis on Iraq had a policy implication, it was to avoid war. Or if war was going to be launched, to prepare for a messy aftermath. What is most remarkable about pre-war US intelligence on Iraq is not that it got things wrong and thereby misled policymakers. It is that it played so small a role in one of the most important US policy decisions of recent decades. I submit that a calm and deliberative process of parliamentary scrutiny of the case for going to war could make a significant contribution to avoiding a similar disconnect between the intelligence assessments and the policy-making process emerging in the course of future Australian consideration of the case for the deployment of the ADF. My proposed solution to this is to, and people in our campaign have different solutions, and we're careful not to preempt the outcome of what the inquiry might. My preferred solution would be to say you can't go to war unless you can get a resolution through both houses. You can't have a budget unless you can get a resolution through both houses. If you can't persuade people that we need to have this war, I suggest that makes it less compelling. What are the principal arguments raised against that? Oh, what if the government doesn't control the Senate? Do you honestly believe that if the nation was really in peril, you would have a problem getting a resolution through the Senate? Oh, but we make these decisions based on information that can't be disclosed. The leader of the opposition is a person who could become Prime Minister tomorrow under our system at any time. You have to be able to disclose. You have to trust the leader of the opposition. You cannot possibly sustain an argument that we cannot trust the opposition with intelligence information. Our system depends on being able to hand over the reins of office as soon as there's a want of confidence in the government. But that one just doesn't apply. Green Senator Scott Ludlam introduced a bill into the Parliament in 2009 referred to for inquiry report, treated with great disdain by both major political parties, and it went nowhere. I, like several others, put a submission in, and I would like to conclude by quoting at some, perhaps not eye-watering length, from another submission, a submission lodged by the eminent military historian Robert O'Neill. Another reason for great care in deciding whether or not to enter a conflict is the need to have good prospects of success. History shows us that the consequences of lost wars are usually very unpleasant indeed for those on the losing side. The case of Iraq in 2003 is a particularly salutary example. Because the Bush administration, impelled largely by Defence Secretary Rumsfeld and Vice President Cheney, had no understanding of the consequences that would follow from the toppling of Saddam, he did not prepare to meet the chaos that ensued. The result was the United States and its allies had become trapped along insurgents, etc. This was right in 2009. This outcome has exposed the serious weakness of the United States armed forces, namely their lack of expertise in the conduct of counterinsurgency operations. Their firepower and ability to inflict death and destruction in occupied territory are formidable, but these apparent strengths are often counterproductive in the insurgency setting. In addition, the United States and many other allied forces have to surmount major cultural, linguistic and social obstacles coming out from behind their armour and weapons as military occupiers to become trusted helpers, even friends of the local people where they are stationed. And he talks about a change of culture which has taken place. He says it's all going to be too slow. I mention these deficiencies in American military capacities to emphasise the point that warfare in the 21st century has become increasingly complex. Therefore, any Australian decision to take part in an allied operation needs to be very carefully considered. The decision should be based on a broad range of analysis and expertise, and especially if it should be in the affirmative. The undertaking of a new military commitment needs the support of the Parliament as a whole. And his final paragraph: in the past, especially in the cases of the Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the decision to commit forces was taken by a small group of ministers in which the Prime Minister played a dominant role. In such a small group, inhibitions based on concerns about the major allies' capacity to fight effectively and win within a period of a year or two, if perceived at all, can be easily swept aside by the desire of the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister or a Cabinet at large to remain close to whoever is the US president at the time of deciding. Also in this system of decision-making, broader issues such as the morality of commitment, which was clearly a major public issue in cases of Vietnam and Iraq, are relatively easy for the government to ignore or set to one side. The small group setting also makes it easier to believe faulty intelligence reports, or even to dismiss them where they are inconvenient to the government's preferred policy. Australia's decisions on commitment to any of these three conflicts would almost certainly have been improved had the proposal been debated in both houses of Parliament.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you, Paul, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming, and I want to thank the Australian Institute for International Affairs for this opportunity to address you this evening on what is, I think, one of the most outstanding issues that Australia is yet to address, which is the manner by which we came to be involved in the invasion of another country in 2003, and how we are going to ensure that we have learned something from that period of our history. I'm going to start by telling you one of the main reasons that I'm here. I'm actually here because in a country about half a world away that it's very easy for us to forget about, literally millions of people have suffered as a result of a war that Australia helped to initiate. Many of them were children who are now either dead or they'll be carrying their suffering for the rest of their lives, physical and psychological suffering. When the decision was made to go to war from the comfort of Canberra, it was a decision that would help bring extreme suffering to millions of people. There wasn't any secret about that. It was known at the time that the heaviest price for this war would be borne by innocent people, including children. Life in Iraq in early 2003 was already pretty bad, following the effects of the 1991 Gulf War and the economic sanctions that were put in place then and carried right through the 1990s. And the effects of the sanctions in the 1991 war were documented repeatedly by UN agencies and by non-government organisations that reported on the virtual destruction of the Iraqi economy, high rates of unemployment, high rates of malnutrition, poor health indicators, especially among children, etc. So reports started to emerge in 2002, 2003 again, that the country would not be capable of withstanding further military conflict. In November 2002, MedAct, which is the UK affiliate of International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, put out a study called Collateral Damage, the Health and Environmental Costs of War on Iraq. The report portrayed a nation in 2002 that was weakened and impoverished. It estimated that new attacks on Iraq would lead to up to 500,000 deaths on all sides, including the effects of the initial attack, ongoing conflict and refugee deaths. The Australian launch of this report, Collateral Damage, was held at Parliament House in Canberra in November 2002, and it received significant media coverage. It was commended by General Peter Gratian, former head of the ADF, who said, "This is not an exaggerated tract by a bunch of zealots. It is a coldly factual report by health professionals who draw on the best evidence available, erring on the side of caution." Another report released in January 2003 also predicted humanitarian disaster in the event of war. Released by the Centre for Economic and Social Rights in New York, which sent a team of experts in food security, public health delivery and infrastructure and emergency medicine. A team of those experts went to Iraq to examine preparedness for further violence. Their report, called The Human Costs of War in Iraq, also stated that the UN and international relief agencies were unprepared for the humanitarian disaster of another war in Iraq. The healthcare system was extremely fragile and grossly inadequate even before the war began. One of the report's authors stated that Iraq has become like a vast refugee camp. This was even before the war began. The authors also expressed concern that Pentagon war plans for Iraq explicitly threaten civilian infrastructure. Another report, also in January 2003, came from the International Study Team, an independent group of academics, researchers and health practitioners whose report was called Our Common Responsibility, the Impact of a New War on Iraqi Children. This report stated, firstly, Iraqi children suffered significant psychological harm from the threat of war that was hanging over them. Secondly, Iraqi children were still in a significantly worse state than they were before the 1991 war. Thirdly, because most of the 13 million Iraqi children were dependent on food distributed by the government, the disruption of this distribution system by war would have a devastating impact on their nutrition. And fourthly, the international community had little capacity to respond to the harm that children would suffer by a new war. Another warning. On 25 February 2003, the World Food Programme warned that the impending invasion might disrupt the government food handouts to millions of Iraqis on which they depended for nutrition. And as predicted, the war did disrupt the food distribution system. So, in a climate of drums beating for war, no Australian parliamentarian had any excuse for not knowing of at least some of these warnings. Many expressed their opposition to our participation in the war and issued a statement in early 2003 noting, quote, "Civilians are the first casualties of war. War will mean further humanitarian and environmental devastation and a flood of new refugees," end quote. Well, the war did begin on 19 March, and as Paul noted, Australian SAS troops were actually in Western Iraq on 18 March, before the ultimatum to Saddam Hussein to leave the country had expired. The effects of the war were apparent very early on. In late March, UNICEF expressed concern at frequent power cuts, leading to cuts to clean water supply in Basra. In April, the International Committee of the Red Cross reported that the medical system in Baghdad had virtually collapsed. Also in April, UN agencies reported that looting and lawlessness obstructed their operations. In July 2003, the UN News Service reported that over 1,000 Iraqi children had been killed or injured by cluster bombs and other unexploded ordnance. There are more reports of the devastating harm. I'm actually going to move on a little. I think you've probably got the picture of that, but there's more detail that could be added to that. The number of refugees from the war was probably between 3.5 and 4.5 million. It was the biggest refugee crisis in the Middle East since 1948. Think of the personal anguish of just one of those 3.5 to 4.5 million and multiply that by several million. And while helping to create this crisis, Australian leaders jostled then as now to see who could be the most inhumane towards the refugee problem, of which Australia sees a tiny fraction. The death toll from the war. It's obviously very difficult to be certain about this. There are difficulties in data collection, and there's an absence of any official civilian casualty figures. Nevertheless, there have been some estimates. In the Lancet Medical Journal in October 2006, a report from respected researchers using sound techniques estimated a figure of 655,000 excess deaths. That's deaths that wouldn't have occurred without the war. And the range within which that 655,000 fell was somewhere between 390 and about 940,000. And they estimated 92% of these were due to direct violence. At the lower end of the estimates is the death toll put out by Iraq Body Count, which monitors press reports and collects its data that way. And the Iraq Body Count up to July 2012 estimated 107 to 117,000 Iraqi civilian deaths from violence as a result of the war. In addition, women's rights have been greatly degraded in this country that was once secular. Under Saddam Hussein, it was a secular society, and it's now torn apart by sectarian violence. A report in The Guardian Weekly in February 2008, 22 February, stated that rape was committed habitually by all the main armed groups in Iraq, and there was a rising incidence of so-called honour killings of women. Under Saddam Hussein, the report said, women in Iraq were widely recognised as among the most liberated in the Middle East, but since the invasion, quote, advances that took 50 years to establish are now crumbling, end of quote. Now, why am I citing all of these reports? It did happen 10 years ago, it's ongoing. The point I'm making is that what happened in Iraq was not unexpected. Nobody can say things went terribly wrong and we didn't know this was going to happen. We did know this was going to happen and the war went ahead anyway, and there's been no accountability for that. There are some important questions that need raising. Paul has mentioned some over a number of aspects of the war, but particularly I'm going to mention questions which we need answers to in relation to the humanitarian effects. Were any reports of the predicted human cost of the war considered before the decision to go to war was made? If so, which ones, and how much weight was given to them? What degree of civilian suffering did the government regard as acceptable, and what contingency plans were made for the injured and the displaced? I'm going to move on. The horrendous price paid for the war by Iraqi civilians is only one reason that we need an inquiry into this war. There are many others, and I should say that any one of the points that I'm going to make to follow should be sufficient reason in itself for an inquiry, but I'll list them. Firstly, and I apologise for overlap with what Paul has said, but I think some overlap probably helps to reinforce some points. Firstly, our democracy was dealt a savage blow. In late 2002 and early 2003, particularly February 15, 2003, there were enormous anti-war demonstrations throughout the world, including in Australia, with hundreds of thousands of people in Australia, that number on the streets obviously representing a much larger number in the community generally, stating that this war should not go ahead. And yet the will of those people and the wisdom that they actually represented was ignored. And that actually has had a very, I believe, detrimental effect on our political and democratic process, because it's helped to strengthen the perception that we don't have good democratic, meaningful debate in this country, and evidence does not mean much in this country. Second point, international law was grossly undermined by the invasion of Iraq. There is widespread agreement, not unanimous, but widespread agreement that the war was illegal. That's a very dangerous precedent to set. Third point, the role of the United Nations was grossly undermined by a self-appointed coalition of countries taking over the role of the United Nations Security Council. In particular, the UN weapons inspectors were marginalised. They wanted more time to get on with their work. Hans Blix and others, including Rod Barton, an Australian weapons inspector at the time, were stating that there was not excessive, there was no forbidding obstruction to their work from the Iraqi government. They wanted time to get on with their task. Fourth point, ANZUS was violated by the invasion of Iraq. Certainly the spirit of ANZUS, and I believe the letter of ANZUS. If you read the ANZUS Treaty, it refers repeatedly to the role of the United Nations in settling international disputes and in preserving international peace and security. And it refers to peaceful means of conflict resolution in the Western Pacific, nothing to do with the Middle East and Pacific generally, nothing to do with the Middle East. Fifth point, Australians are now more at risk of terrorist attack than they were before the invasion of Iraq, certainly before our so-called war on terror generally. Sixth point, the Middle East as a whole has been greatly destabilised, and in particular Iraq, and I'm sure you all know that as well as I do. Iraq previously had no history of suicide bombers or jihadists before the invasion, but they are now pretty frequent occurrence suicide bombers in the streets and markets and other places of Iraq. Seventh point, the Australian Defence Force troops were committed to a war of dubious, probably zero, but at least dubious legality, and without the support of the Australian people whom they undertake to protect. They've been exposed to terrible situations, and some of them will suffer severe health effects as a consequence. Many people would see this as an abuse of the dedication and service that the ADF provide. Eighth point, economically, the war has probably cost Australia around $3 billion. We don't know the exact figure. Most Australians would want some accountability for the squandering of an amount of money of this magnitude. Prime Minister Julia Gillard and Defence Minister Smith have both rejected quite quickly the call for an inquiry into how we became involved in the war. So it's a bit as if all these things that I've mentioned, the undermining of the United Nations, violation of ANZUS, increasing our risk of terrorism, squandering this money, putting the ADF at risk, quite apart from the enormous humanitarian effect. It's as if all this is a little blip on our history. We've got to forget that and move on now and pretend that we've learned something. Unfortunately, the people of Iraq don't have the luxury of moving on from this. But we're having nightmares in decades, literally decades, as a result of this, as will many of the coalition troops. If we are to learn anything from this, we need to examine how this unfolded to make sure that we prevent a recurrence in the future, the next time that we are called on to support one of our allies' wars, which we will be, either through pressure from the United States or from pressure within Australia to get involved in another US war. So there will be further occasions, and unless we learn something from 2003, we're likely to make the same mistakes. So the call for an inquiry is about accountability and preventing a recurrence of what happened in 2003. It's not designed to bring particular individuals to court for alleged crimes of aggression, although there is no reason that such alleged crimes should be ignored just because they were committed by Western leaders. However, that is not the goal of the campaign which we are talking about this evening, which is to seek a change of the way in which Australian troops are sent to war, so that never again can our troops be sent to war on the basis of the decision of a Prime Minister against the will of the Australian people and without this even being debated in our Parliament. Democracy shouldn't work like that. Dictatorships, yes, but not democracy. As Paul mentioned, we have inquiries into a number of things of importance but far lesser significance than this one. Recently, when 2 Afghan boys were killed in Afghanistan with the involvement of ADF troops, Minister Stephen Smith stated that when a tragedy like this occurs, there is always a full inquiry to work out what went wrong, how can we prevent this from happening in future. That was for 2 Afghan boys, as it should be. We need to know why those boys died. But we also need to know why hundreds of thousands of Iraqi people died since 2003 with Australia's involvement. Thank you. I'm certainly not an expert in intelligence matters, but Rod Barton, whom I mentioned earlier, has written quite a bit on this because he was one of the, an Australian, one of the weapons inspectors. And he's referred to the slightly different roles played by ONA within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Defence Intelligence Organisation, and given the opinion that ONA were more upbeat in trying to provide the Prime Minister with what they thought he wanted to hear, whereas the Defence Intelligence Organisation were stating that in their view Iraq had not restarted its WND program since the weapons inspectors of the early 1990s. So I think it probably depends what intelligence agency in Australia we were talking about.
It is easy to make an allegation of that kind. I think it had much more to do with the so-called Balkans before the Republicans came to power, saying we're the most powerful military force the world has ever seen, and we're going to reshape the world to be the way. We're going to use that power as a force for good. We're going to reshape the world in our own image. I wouldn't say that, but in the way things ought to be. And but it's very hard to put out of your mind that throughout his tenure, Vice President Cheney remained an officer of Halliburton, and Halliburton got a whole lot of no-bid contracts in Iraq. But I think that was opportunistic corruption, not the main driver of the war. One is tempted to, let me first make a facetious response, which is not meant to be disrespectful of your question, but just in terms of that general proposition that we're investing in the relationship, I just wonder how grateful Barack Obama feels to Julia Gillard that John Howard went to war with George W. Bush. It is a pretty ephemeral thing. Now, okay, you can say that's facetious, and that nevertheless the Americans say we're a reliable ally. Every time they go into a stupid bloody war, we're always with them. But let me now turn to my response to your question. I said that I'd like to see us. I guess I'm talking about either an amendment to the Defence Act or a bill like Scott Ludlam's that says you can't send the ADF off to international armed conflict without getting a resolution through both houses of Parliament. One of our colleagues, Professor Charles Sanford of the Key Centre for Ethics, Law, Governance, etc. at Griffith University, has another proposal which I would like to add to that, and that is a requirement that the Attorney General tables in Parliament a statement that this is a legal war, not simply an assertion, a made-out case as to why, on the best legal judgment you can make, this war is legal. Now that would be very easy to make if there was a resolution of the UN Security Council backing it. And part of that statement would be a statement that we will submit ourselves to compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice on that matter. So we're telling the Parliament, there's an onus on the Attorney General to tell the Parliament that this is a legal war and why it's legal, and that we will submit ourselves to compulsory jurisdiction. Now you come to the vote of the Parliament. They've now been told it's a legal war. A lot of people say, well, the Parliament will vote on party lines. Parliament predictably votes on party lines when Cabinet has already made a decision, or when the Prime Minister and a small group has made a decision, as has been our decision-making process, because there's nothing they can do. And they can hide behind, well, I mean, what can I do? Our job now is to support the troops and to vote them the money and show them all our goodwill, etc., etc. So you can hide behind it. When you are asked to actually participate in the decision-making process, I'm not sure that that would be the case. When you get something like gay marriage, abortion law reform, voluntary euthanasia, you quickly get into the conscience vote because people know the party whips can't command the vote. And I wonder if every member of Parliament knows that they're being asked to put themselves on the record, yes, I vote to put our young men and women in harm's way into this conflict, that'll be on the record forever. Hillary Clinton has to live with the fact that she voted for the Iraq War. Everybody knows that Hillary Clinton thought the Iraq War was a great idea. Now, I just don't think it will be as predictable as people fear if we have the vote. But my final point would be, if they've been told that it's a legal war and they vote for it, I might think it's a stupid decision, but I can hardly complain that we haven't had the democratic process. Now, you raised also the question of the intelligence. I think where our parliamentarians have to vote themselves, there'll be a bit more due diligence than we see when the decision's already made. You just put in a resolution to support an already made decision. So we can only hope.
Only briefly, and yes, it is a very important question. As to whether it would have made any difference in 2000, I'll stand up. As to whether it would have made any difference in 2003, I don't know, but there were quite a lot within the ALP, including the leadership, that were speaking not in favour after Howard's announcement. There was, to the extent that any debate was possible, there were certainly negative comments raised. So maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't have. But I think your question raises also the really important issue of Australia's interests versus US interests, and the difficulty that we have in this country of trying to get any distinction between the two of them, particularly from our leaders who seem to equate US interests with Australian interests. And I think we need to start to question that among ourselves and in society generally. And you might be aware there's been a new network formed, Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, which is a number of people who are looking at this issue of trying to get some independence in Australia's foreign policy. and to distinguish our interests from the US. And often they will align, the US and Australian interests will align, but often they won't. And I think we need to be able to think independently about these things.
Thank you. Kath Radnoff.
I would agree, Hamish. It seems to me that the pattern which the Americans have noticed is that whoever's the Australian leader, we say, we really want to be there, and the next question is, how little can we get away with? And that goes back to the question of being a long-term investment in the American alliance. If the people who are part of that investment notice that you're trying to cheapskate it, how big an investment is it? But I think it also just shows up how political is this decision. It is not a matter of national security at all. It is a matter of political advantage for the party in office, and there's no big advantage in having people come home in body bags. So you want to be there, but you want to be there at as little price as you can.
Yeah, I agree with Paul's comments, and I guess it could strike one as a bit gutless that we go to war but aren't prepared to accept the consequence of that. And my only other comment, which is slightly unrelated, but it does remind one of the situations with drone warfare, where it's really warfare where we're not prepared to accept any casualties on our own side, disregarding what the casualties on the other side would be doing to the mindset of the enemy, creating more enemies all the time.